Their faces are frozen in time. 5 Australian-based newsmen, all in their 20s, each in their prime. They were executed 34 years ago in a place most people have never heard of or have since forgotten. Balibo, East Timor. The killers remain at large. So even after all this time, the families are prepared to make the long, painful journey back to Balibo in their search for justice. What does Balibo mean to you two?
There's so many conflicting emotions, so many aspects of our life. Our lives were turned upside down basically in 1975 when our brother was killed.
Greg and Anne Cunningham never got a chance to say goodbye to their older brother, Gary. So the road to Balibo is full of mixed emotions.
Yeah, and you can just feel them all around, and yeah, but I just want to cry now thinking about it. That's the place where he died. He never came back from that place.
It's this one up, isn't it?
This is the house where they were killed.
And there in the centre of town, we find the ruined building where the men, known as the Balibo 5, were murdered by Indonesian Special Forces.
Yeah, it's still as haunting and spooky as ever, I think. While the structure's here, you'll always have the mental image of these walls. Knowing that, one of the walls, against one of the walls, our brother was when he was shot. So how do we know?
Just think if these walls could talk, what would they say?
Yeah, I know.
What would they say?
The Australian Federal Police recently announced a war crimes investigation into what took place here. But they shouldn't hold their breath expecting the Indonesians to help. As far as they're concerned, it's case closed. If 5 Indonesians were murdered in Australia, would you expect us to track down the killers?
On what conditions?
It's a simple question, sir.
Let me emphasize again, time and again, this is the war, condition of the war.
They were journalists, sir, not soldiers. Malcolm Rennie, Greg Shackleton, Brian Peters, Gary Cunningham and Tony Stewart are seen here in Balibo in October 1975, less than 24 hours before they died. They travelled here to report on Indonesia's secret plans to surge across the border from West Timor and seize control of its tiny neighbour. The man who drove them there was a young freedom fighter who went on to become East Timor's president, Jose Ramos Horta.
We went straight to Balibo. I drove the jeep myself.
Do you feel any personal guilt because you took them there?
Knowing what I know, I would not have taken them there, but at the time, we all had the illusions. I had the illusion that the Indonesian side would never touch a journalist.
The Balibo 5 certainly believed that.
At any rate, we look like being the last people left in the town.
They assumed as long as the invading troops knew they were Australian media, they'd be safe.
We've daubed our house with the word Australia in red and the Australian flag in the house where we spent the night. We're hoping it will afford us some protection.
Those famous images of reporter Greg Shackleton were filmed by cameraman Gary Cunningham. I can see the resemblance.
Can you? Yeah, I think Gary and I were a lot like our mother. Yes, I'm just very sad looking at his picture, like I miss my brother when she was around. Yep.
Exactly what happened in the early hours of October 16 has, until recently, been shrouded in mystery, covered up by successive Indonesian and Australian governments.
There's no proof, Greg.
But an Australian coroner's report in 2007 and the newly released film Balibo have, according to most, set the record straight about what did happen when the Indonesian forces surged across the border into the town of Balibo.
Let's go!
Just as dawn broke, a couple of thousand Indonesian soldiers came pouring over that hill.
It was more than anyone had bargained for, and the 5 newsmen who were trying to film their arrival came under heavy fire. So they sprinted down here into the centre of Balibo. But in the chaos, instead of turning right and heading back to where they were staying, they turned left and ran straight into a place the locals call the Chinese house.
Come on! In those terrifying moments, it soon became apparent to the 5 men that they and their footage were the targets. The Indonesians didn't want the world to know what they were doing. Then, cameraman Brian Peters, the most experienced, walked out to surrender. The Indonesians then burst into the Chinese house, determined to kill the rest of the team.
This is where 3 of them were killed, Greg?
This is where the 3, Greg Shackleton, Malcolm Rennie and our brother Gary Cunningham were killed in this room.
So these bullet holes in the wall,
Yep.
I take it that these are still remnants of
Yes, of the time.
the shots that were fired that morning.
Yeah, I wonder which ones, there's so many.
34 years later, Greg and Anne are still putting the gruesome jigsaw together in the burnt-out shell of the Chinese house.
Would you want to know exactly where Gary was standing when he was shot?
Yeah, I could probably touch the wall. Maybe it's right here. I'd be like feeling him, wouldn't it? But if that's possible, but yeah, I would actually. Now I'm standing here. It would be good to know.
Sharing those last moments, isn't it?
Yeah,
It sort of brings you
that's
closer,
right.
is that what you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
The official government line in Jakarta has always been the men were killed accidentally in crossfire.
During the war, it's a lot confusion might take place.
Teku Fazishah is the official spokesman.
Our understanding of the issues is that they were killed during the crossfire. So that's our understanding, and that's...
And if you were wrong?
Well,
That means one of your Indonesian countrymen is a murderer.
war is war. To be killed in the crossfire in the line of war, it's a risk that anyone can happen.
War is not war, sir. When those men were killed walking down the middle of the street with their hands in the air.
That's the understanding of your side.
But Indonesia's version of events completely ignores eyewitness accounts of the newsmen's executions. Alberto was a young porter for the Indonesian army. He saw the men plead for their lives inside the Chinese house.
He said, "Journalist, I'm a journalist." But the Indonesians didn't want to know about him being a journalist and fired off shots. The one standing fell to the ground, and then they fired at the other 2 who were seated on the ground.
You saw the Australian newsmen murdered by Indonesian soldiers.
I saw it, absolutely, with my own eyes.
It's an extraordinary moment for the Cunninghams. Finally, they come face to face with an eyewitness to their brother's execution.
Do you remember what they looked like? If there was big man, short man, do you remember?
Our brother was a
looked
very
like?
big man. The biggest of all 3, all 5, yeah.
He looked like this lady and was a big person like you. The one who died saying, "I'm a journalist," looked like you.
And he was shot. Where was he shot? In the head or his body? Or do you remember what part that he was shot in?
I just saw him shot and fall immediately. I didn't see if he was shot here or here.
You know the man or the men who killed them?
There were 2 people who killed them. One whose name I know was called Chris. The other name I have forgotten. It was 34 years ago.
Chris, or Cristo da Silva, was under the command of this man, Captain Yunus Yosfia, who other witnesses have named as one of the killers. Today, Mr. Yosfia is an Indonesian politician. He's never faced charges, never been fully investigated, and steadfastly refused to speak to us.
Should the people responsible for your brother's murder be tried as war criminals, Greg?
Yep, definitely. They were murdered in cold blood.
If Australia tried to extradite Yunus Yosfia, what would Indonesia do about that?
I don't believe that will happen at any way, because we never, in our policy, it never been in our policy to extradite any of our nationals.
There are still eyewitnesses alive who can tell you what they saw, what they heard.
Well, you may conduct your inquiries on your side.
But you'll do nothing on the Indonesian side.
Certainly in our case it's not. It's a case closed.
Tell that to the Peters family. Tell that to the Stewart family. Tell it to the Cunningham family. Tell it to the Shackleton family. Tell it to the Rennie family.
I've told you already. I understand the situation. We're sympathetic with the situation.
You're sympathetic, but you'll do nothing.
Well, by expressing our sympathy, by understanding that grievances will take time to subside.
Thank you very much.
It's been a long and painful battle for the truth about the Balibo Five. And it's not just the Indonesians who refuse to confront what happened. Australian governments, desperate to keep good relations with Indonesia, have been just as guilty of sweeping Balibo under the carpet.
The actions of successive Australian governments since then has made it worse. I mean, we've had no support. All we've had basically until recently, until after the coroner's inquest, we've had just lies and blatant lies.
Successive Australian governments, no, they knew, but they knew that if they were to make a big fuss about it, it would rock the boat of the relationship between Australia and Indonesia back then. And East Timor was a minor issue at that time in Australia.
We pray that at this present moment they are enjoying your blessed presence.
The Australian government was so keen not to rock the boat that none of the families of the 5 men were invited to their funeral. Strangely enough, without any of them being formally identified, the remains were placed in a single coffin and buried here in Jakarta's biggest cemetery. Just 2 days later, the very thing that these journalists were trying to warn the world about, the invasion of East Timor, began. It was an invasion and occupation that led to the death of some 180,000 East Timorese. That's 20% of the population. Indonesia's rule finally ended 10 years ago, and Australia is helping this battered little country get to its feet.
Laptop for you, a laptop of Elvis, so hopefully, you can use that for some good.
The Cunninghams are doing their bit too, donating to causes like the Living Memory Project for political prisoners.
Our brother was only here for a short time, but this country is part of him. He's now part of this country, and his spirit will always be with the Timorese people, and our spirit will be.
Balibo! 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 Balibo!
But as these people embrace the future, Greg and Anne want to make sure no one forgets the reality of the past. Truth was the first casualty of war at a place called Balibo.
What do you think Gary would say to you today if he was here?
He'd just go, just keep on going. Just don't give up. And we won't.